Morning. Hi, you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Jacob and Zoe and Anne and Thornton Tomasetti for having all of this morning. I'm Laura Britton. I'm an associate at Shigeru Ban Architects and the author of Shigeru Ban Timber and Architecture. I also teach at the Cooper Union and am the co-founder of the Mass Timber Pedagogy Project. I'd say from the outside, that probably sounds like the culmination of a very well planned career. But when I was sitting in your seat, I had a lot of the same questions that you might have now about what I wanted to do next, or even who might hire me, which I know is a big question as you're finishing architecture school. So, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm going to very quickly go through the past 2 decades in under 10 minutes, as we've promised, weave together how that path came to be. So I got my undergrad degree at Yale, and I initially entered with the intention of double majoring in math and music. The liberal arts setup at Yale was very beneficial because I was able to find architecture as a lens to explore all of my other interests. I then went to Japan on a travel fellowship where I explored the relationship between structure and aesthetics in both historical and contemporary Japanese architecture. I came back extremely enthusiastic and told my parents, "Oh, I just can't wait to go back to Japan again." And my mom said, "Wait a second, I thought you got that out of your system. What do you mean?" And I didn't quite have an answer yet, but I knew that this would be a building block for something in the future. The summer after I graduated, I went to Denmark and did a furniture design program. And this was building on my interests in materiality and really seeing the design process from concept through execution. So I early on knew that I had an interest in fabrication. And then I came back to the US and I said, okay, who's going to hire me? I don't have a professional degree because Yale has a 4 year undergrad program and I have no work experience. And I was very lucky to land at Picard Chilton Architects in New Haven. I wanted to get this professional experience before going back to grad school so that I could understand a little bit more about what it's like to work as an architect. And this was really the foundation of learning how to work on a team, how a drawing set comes together. And this early experience, I draw from it today. My colleagues are still close friends and contacts who I see all the time. I admire their work. And so it really it is the start of a trajectory, but I didn't quite see where I was headed yet. In parallel with architectural practice, I really missed making, and so I took some metalworking classes on the side to continue working on furniture projects. And then I applied to grad school and I asked everyone for advice on where to go, how to craft my portfolio, my personal statement, etc. And I was told nearly universally, if you want to be an architect, don't go to Princeton. And so I went to Princeton. I knew that I wanted to be an architect. I knew that I wanted to be in practice, but I didn't think I wanted to take the time away from practice to do both an MArch and a PhD. And Princeton was the perfect environment for me to take history and theory courses alongside the PhD students, explore writing, explore research, but still be focused on design. During the summers, I returned to Japan and I worked at Su Fujimoto Architects, as well as Atelier Bowa. And then I got another research grant to go back to Japan and interview Fujimoto-san alongside Akihisa Hirata and Junya Shigami. And this, if you ever have the chance to interview architects, it's great to ask people, how did you get to where you got to? What motivates you? What are your interests? I knew that I had this interest in contemporary Japanese architecture, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was that united all of these projects. And then I got to work for a fantastic faculty member at Princeton, Paul Lewis, on his book, Manual of Section, which is by LTL Architects. We were working on section perspective drawings of canonical buildings. This was really fun from a representation perspective, but also to learn how professional publications come together. And then I got a job at Shigeru Ban Architects, which sounds like a really clean end to that arc. But in actuality, I graduated, and for several months, I didn't know where I was heading next. I had actually applied to Shigeru Ban Architects for an internship years prior and just never heard back, which is extremely common. So, all of that to say, luck is a really big part of this process, and timing. Sometimes it's in your favor, sometimes it isn't. I was very fortunate that they had a junior architect position open in New York when I was applying because we didn't hire anyone else at that level for several years. So if I graduated a year later, I would be in a totally different position today. I was also very fortunate that the very first project that I worked on at Shigeru Ban Architects was a mass timber project, and this has been my area of focus for about the past 10 years. So I'll briefly go through one of our recent projects. This is Kentucky Owl Park, which is a bourbon distillery in a 400-acre former limestone quarry. It's a timber space frame structure in a pyramidal form. And on the right, you can see the Aspen Art Museum. This has a space frame roof as well. And so in a lot of our projects, we adapt past forms to evolve them for future projects. And so here there's a lot more complexity as these multiple space frames integrate in a three-dimensional form of a pyramid. Um, my favorite part of this kind of work is interdisciplinary collaboration. And so, just very quickly, I want to go through this is work that we completed. All of the next few slides are just from schematic design. And so, this is work with Design to Production, which is a digital facilitator. We were trying to document the base geometry of the pyramid, considering the nested forms of outside face of facade and top and bottom face of the structural chords. And this was something that we kept parametric. We maintain formulas throughout, so using trigonometry to document our annotations rather than rounding early on in the process. This level of precision allows us to construct to zero point 0.1 millimeter tolerance so that when you have a complex timber structure, everything's sort of in alignment when you complete construction. We also worked with our fabricator Spearhead to determine optimized forms for material sheet layouts, as well as maximal transportable lengths for bringing the material from this is British Columbia down to our site in Kentucky. Our structural engineers, Creation Holtz and KLNA, helped us with both member sizing as well as assembly sequencing, and then thinking about how we would erect the structure, how we would stage it on the site. And this is all work that we start at the outset of concept design. This is all from our schematic design package. And so I really thrive on those conversations where it's a whole bunch of consultants that are collaborating rather than being sort of in the architect genius model where you sit down and you sketch something and you hand it off and someone tells you how you execute it. From all of this work, I knew coming in, I like to find resources. And so I wanted to find a book on mass timber. And I remember Googling this 2013, could not find a holistic text on mass timber. And I sort of wondered why this didn't exist. And I also wondered why our office hadn't published all of its works consolidated on timber. And so I went to Shigeru one day and I said, why don't we do this? And he said, well, who would write the book? And I said, oh, I could write the book. And he said, okay. And so that's how the next project started. Um, I was not an expert on timber at the start of that project. But I learned so much similar to the interview projects. I got to talk to the project manager for 45 separate projects included in the book and learn all of the trials and tribulations of working with wood and how these projects evolved from concept through to the completion of construction. So here's one example project. This is Tamatic Nagoya, which is located in an urban condition in Japan where mass timber construction is not allowed. And so instead, Shigeru devised a unique system to maintain this biophilic natural environment by using CLT, which is cross-laminated timber, as permanent formwork for a concrete structure. And so walking through in much more detail the construction photos, these new diagrams we produced for the book, that became the basis of a lecture series. Uh, and it focuses on the theme of this presentation, which was seedling to structure. So kind of going from the forest to the completed building. And then also the idea of collaboration. It always takes a team. This team in particular was the team behind putting my book together. It's not, there's never a single author, there's never a single architect. I think it's really important to recognize the interdisciplinary nature of these projects and that you can take on any one of these roles. You can be an architect, you can also be someone who has a really great architectural background who works with architects. So from there, I had the opportunity to join the International Mass Timber Conference Committee, and I recently started teaching at the Cooper Union. I taught a biogenic materials studio last year, and more recently got a grant from the Softwood Lumber Board to establish the Mass Timber Pedagogy Working Group. And we're putting together materials, like teaching materials, to introduce mass timber coursework in schools, because particularly in the Northeast, we don't see so much of that, whereas in states with heavily sponsored forestry programs like Arkansas and Oregon, it's much more common. So, in hindsight, yes, there's a very linear trajectory from school to work to school to work. Japan trajectory, it's a little bit all over the map. And every time I would leave Japan, I'd say, "Oh, I don't know when I can go back." But it all kind of weaves together. Similarly, materiality. I went from this interest in furniture design to the interest of like really specific materiality, uh, focusing on wood, but then also how wood integrates with other materials, and that's the basis of a lot of my work today. And lastly, academia, research, writing, teaching. This was an area that I knew I had an interest in early on, and that was another driver for wanting to go to Princeton. I had looked up the faculty at every school I was considering. I saw so many people who teach go to Princeton, and I thought, okay, I want to learn. I want to learn the way they learn. I want to learn how to become that kind of educator. And this is something that has come to fruition more so in recent years, but just kind of setting up the steps to get there. Lastly, I want to say there's a lot that doesn't go on this diagram. The personal life side of thing, extremely important. I still play oboe in an orchestra. I have, a lovely dog who sometimes comes to the office. I enjoy spending time with my family. That's as important as your resume. So, a few parting thoughts. I would say learn from every experience. Not every job you have is going to be a perfect fit. And whether it's the idea that you like drawing, or you like making, or you like being in a large, bustling environment, or something much quieter, those are easy takeaways from each experience. Next, find work and people that you believe in. It's been really easy for me to work for Shigeru Ban for the past year because I believe in his ethos, whether it's working on humanitarian work or prioritizing environmental considerations in our projects. It's easy to support that mission. Recognize the role of luck and timing. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Revisit your goals and interests often. This I think is an important one, because if you're working really hard and you keep your head down, you might not notice that you're bypassing opportunities to do what you want to do instead of what you're told to do. The day I met my husband, he was teaching at a university at the time, and I said, "Oh, I would love to teach someday." He said, "Well, why aren't you doing that?" And I immediately got started refocusing, trying to head in that direction. Next, create opportunities. My book project, it would have been great if someone said, "Hey, do you want to write this?" But that was more so identifying a gap and seeing how I could step into it. Sometimes it's as easy as talking to your project manager, your boss, and saying, "Hey, can I work on this? I'd like to be doing a certain type of project, or a certain, work with a certain software." If you get a no, then maybe that's a good sign that it's a time to pivot. And lastly, define your own version of success. I know I have a couple of students in the room. Success is not what your faculty members say or what your boss says. It's what you define for how you want to spend your time, both professionally and personally, to find holistic fulfillment. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Betsy Daniel. I'm currently an assistant vice president at EDC. But actually, the title of this presentation, and while I was putting this together, is called "It's Okay to Not Know." Very much a working title, very much a work in progress of who I am. I've always been a go getter, driven, curious person, but I'm interested in the built environment, but didn't know that architecture and this kind of career path that I went through would lead me to that. Um, and so I actually didn't know growing up I wanted to be an architect. I think a lot of you, and maybe this is different from what your experience is. I did not grow up playing with Legos, drawing sketches, creating those constructions. I actually was curious about a lot of different things. My parents were trying to direct me into a career path and try to focus in what my intentions was, but it wasn't a dream to be an architect and building buildings. The things that I was curious about was the people around me, being an idealist, collective, working for a social change. And then architecture became a vehicle to do those things. And so my story really starts from an immigrant background. My parents came from India in the late 80s, and I was born in kind of these two worlds between India and America. Those two different values of growing up of a go-getter driven, which I think are very American values, to Indian values, which about the family, collectivism. And so merging those two things together, growing up in different neighborhoods or weren't quite urban or the built density of we see in New York City today. So starting in Queens Village, then to the suburbia, and then kind of balancing back into Kerala. Every summer I would go to Kerala, India, and this back and forth culture, it wasn't really necessarily meant that my identity wasn't one thing, it was multiple things, especially growing up in that type of environment. Very much these two worlds, Queens and Long Island and Kerala, shaped who I was. I grew up one foot in American culture and the other foot in Indian values. And as I said before, I didn't know I wanted to be an architect, but I think the values of what architecture can bring, bringing change, about bringing working together, community oriented, deeply invested, these journey, deeply invested in who I am. So when I went into architecture school, I didn't actually know what architecture could do. Maybe I wasn't a great student, but I went to Syracuse Architecture, both both for it's a well-known program, and then really why architecture out of all my experiences is really because my cousin was an architect. He kind of showed me what he did, and I was curious about it. I was a creative person. I was pretty good at school, and this is just kind of led it one way to another. I actually wanted to be a graphic designer. My parents were like, nope, that probably doesn't pay well. And also architecture doesn't pay well either. I think like when I went into architecture school, words like section, void, and form were completely foreign to me. Your first project, or maybe it's different for you all, it was make a cube, define space. I was like, I spent a lot of money on educate my schooling. Like, what does this all mean? And I think what really started to move me into like, oh, this is actually what I like, and this is what I'm curious about, and this is the understanding of the built environment was through classes, particular Professor Julia Zerniak, who is a professor who taught about urban landscapes. And so really what I realized through doing architecture school was not necessarily the buildings, but all the spaces in between. So this photo in particular is of Lagos. So I became invested in cities in the global south of really the kind of things that we can't predict with our design, even though we as an architect learn how to create drawings, create structure and order, we can't plan for the messiness of urbanity. And so I was really invested of like, how do economies come together? How do markets come together? Things that architecture couldn't really answer, but really what I was invested in is like, how do we enable this in all in the spaces that we create? And so my thesis, and it was not an architecture project, it was really creating a physical framework, an adaptive piece of infrastructure that could evolve with community needs. So this was in Mumbai. It was a waterfront site, and basically an idea that it would have been a typical waterfront development, but really my project was like, what if we just create half the project and let the community or other drivers build in the rest? So this is all great. I was really excited leaving school. And then what I ended up doing in the like few months after was not able to get a job. That is reality. And that's what I think Laura mentioned is like, there are times when you're just waiting and applying. What I did know coming out of school is that I need to make sure that I either really wanted to be an architect in the practical sense, or did I wanted to pivot and do something else? In the back of my head, I always knew I wanted to go back to school, especially coming out of my thesis of studying urban design, infrastructure, systems thinking. And so, but I was like, let me try to be an architect. So I worked at Andre Kukowski Architect, which is a really small boutique firm. This is one of the projects I worked on, 75 Kenmare, which is like a multifamily residential building in Soho, NoHo. And it was great to have that experience of creating details for the architecture project, but like the people that we're creating for, this is like a very luxury building, and I think it didn't align with the values that I grew up with. And so I feel like we all have very similar diagrams of like trajectory path. And this is what I thought leaving school would lead me to. I'd be a project architect. And then I realized as I went into that role, especially in my first job, it was not the case. It was a twisted kind of let me find different things and I lead with curiosity in those different things. And so I think one thing I do want to mention here is like I also wanted to be licensed. I think for my parents and for the culture that came up, this was a just a next trajectory. And I realized I will become licensed, but I didn't become licensed right away, and it takes a path to get there. As I mentioned, I did wanted to go back to school, and I really to reinvest in ideas I learned from my architectural thesis. So I went to Columbia University for the Master's of Architecture and Urban Design, and really their program is invested of how to think about the 21st century cities and urban landscapes. And so worked on projects from Jordan to New York City, and really thinking about those different landscapes, and really what it encouraged me is part of the work is really about engaging with communities, with neighborhoods. And so part of their actual program itself is having you go out into the neighborhoods, into the places that you're actually working with. And that actually reinvested things into what I was actually interested in doing. I backpocketed, I went to work at HOK, which is a large interdisciplinary global firm. And again, my thing is like I got to try it and see what it is in practice before making a pivot into something else. And so this is what I call the practice of urban design, working on large like campus institutional planning projects. In this case, nearly 200 acres of uh, old naval base in San Francisco, and the image on the left, and then looking at the 21st century or 2100s coastlines of New York City. And then kind of pivot back to, I learned to work in a multidisciplinary way. I think what you don't learn necessarily in architecture school is that you won't have all the answers. There's a lot more other people who might have the answers to your projects, to your thoughts. What, especially after 2020, with the social reckoning and the murder of George Floyd, I think there was just a realignment to the values that I had. So I joined the AIA Civic Leadership Program, which took together 10 cohorts of emerging designers and architects who were interested in being civic leaders. I myself, with Akemi, who's actually on the panel, became part of the Urban Design Forum cohort. Again, thinking about equity in the design and the places that we are looking at, in this particular, in the lens of waste management. And so I think what I've learned through these different fellowships is that we have to work together. We have to work in a multidisciplinary way. We as architect, designers, urban planners, urban designers won't have all those answers. And I think I think part of the education that I had was taking classes in different disciplines, taking classes in things like politics and economics and things like that. I think that just widens your branch of like what you can actually do and what the purpose you can do. And then I'll quickly go through some of the projects that I'm currently working on. As I mentioned at the top, I work at EDC, so that stands for the Economic Development Corporation for New York City. Basically, we are a quasi-governmental agency that works on behalf of New York City to grow inclusive New York through economic development. And so what does that all mean? That basically means we manage a lot of New York City's assets or pieces of infrastructure, buildings, about 62 million square feet, and then redevelop them for many different purposes. And so I work in the planning division, so we're a mix of planners and architects and urban designers, and working on different planning projects for the city. This image right now is an existing condition, but this is the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. It's 122 acres on the Brooklyn waterfront. And so it's a vision to reimagine this as a 21st century modern maritime port and mixed use development. This is Coney Island West. Again, we work across the 5 boroughs on different scales of projects and types of development, whether that's a port to housing in this case. And so actually EDC manages the Coney Island Amusement Park. Basically, we hold the lease, but then we're part of the reimagining what the neighborhood around it could look like. And so this is the final unlocking of that area. Again, different boroughs. We're at Staten Island, the North Shore. This is parcels that were vacant. Was part of a whole naval base along the Staten Island coastline, and this will be the largest mass timber project largest mass timber residential project in New York City. And then we also work at scales of in Manhattan as well. And this is the Science Park and Research Center. And this is a mixed use campus of both life science and public health and education. And it's to redevelop the Brookdale campus in New York City. I know that was a lot, but I think the main thing is that I wanted to share is that lead with curiosity. I think that never led me astray. It was a way of knowing that what I was really passionate about, it didn't have to look like a project architect at a firm, but it could be ways of like, I was interested in this. Let me pivot and try something else. And I think always leading with that curiosity never led me wrong. It may not have looked, I may not have known this job existed if I didn't reach out, learn from my colleagues, learn from the others. And so I think always school is just one part of that learning process. And so just continuing to learn as you go through your education. Thank you.
Everybody. It's great to see such a large crowd on a Saturday to spend your time firms in the Architectural League. My name is David Polk. I'm the Regional Chief Architect for the U.S. General Services Administration. It's until recently, it was a little known federal agency that deals with real estate. I'll get into some of that, but there's an outline of kind of what I want to talk about that really all centers around design excellence. It didn't really matter whether it's professional or personal or academia, the type of person who like pressures themselves to strive for excellence in whatever I touch. Like if I'm going to touch it, I'm going to touch it once and make sure that it's actually worth my time. And I'll go through some things that were kind of non-linear, um, different phases or periods of life, and a few projects as well. So similarly, it's not like there's some linear path to whatever success is, and it's always a moving target. And I think we all understand that it's easier in hindsight to understand what there is. But there are these little buckets of whatever education, academia, profession, or just like this other miscellaneous thing, category of other. But the reality, I'm going to go through this really quickly, is there's a lot of stuff, right? And this is kind of my point. A lot of these things are happening simultaneously. It's this attention economy that we have of whatever can you fit into a day. But I do just want to admit that throughout this trajectory, there are some really real moments of FOMO or imposter syndrome. When I first graduated from undergrad, a lot of my classmates left to like a postgraduate program in Chicago with Gensler and Canon Design and SOM. And I chose not to go. I was like, is that a big mistake? And I moved to DC, started trying to find a job. And I'm like, they started their program, then it started to feel worse. And I'm like, wait, I'm still looking for a job. And then I landed my job with the GSA as an intern with the Design Excellence program. And like my world completely changed because I understood what real impact, not just in architecture, but across development was. And it really was very lucky. I can explain that whole situation of how I was even hired at GSA within 30 days. It's actually like 20 days, which is like unheard of with government hiring. But it was really a pivotal moment for me to understand what is the federal government doing for its buildings? What does it mean to have a presence in a community for the federal government? What does it mean to show up for the citizens and manifest that through architecture, through the built environment, through plazas, through continued maintenance of buildings and parks? Um, there's this phase of academia where I really started because I was like, oh no, student loans are due. And I realized I needed a second job. and I was considering being a barista or a bartender. It's like, you know what? I stumbled upon this opportunity to be an adjunct, and in a lot of practical ways, it was much easier than um, these other second jobs, but was also good for the resume. And I really wanted to teach as well. So it kind of checked all these boxes. The opportunity presented itself. Um, Not all of the positions that I taught in were great. Honestly, not all the classes were great. Not all the students were great. um, Sometimes, deadlines can um, change perspectives of, oh no, something's late. But the photo on the left is when I was teaching exhibition design at the Corcoran School, and help them transition a lot of their program from just being a feeder into the Smithsonian to really thinking about exhibition design as what is retail? Luxury retail nowadays is a whole experience, or what is New York Fashion Week? What is on display? You're exhibiting people and clothes, um, or even like world tours of the Beyonce formation. I've had students that have actually gone on to do these jobs, to work at the Whitney, work at production companies, do world tours. And then most recently in New York, this is also in Virginia Tech, but was co-partnering with Lori Hawkinson at Columbia and Aaron Betsky at Virginia Tech to talk about post office of like how do you redevelop an agency that really needs to evolve? It's not obsolete, but what is the post office? And there were two studios. I traveled to Blacksburg and was at Columbia several times to present and be a juror and have these really great conversations about the most public definition of public space of the federal government. I also was able to buy an apartment in DC during the pandemic, and I was only able to afford it because it was such shitty shape, honestly. But renovated this apartment in a way to create value for something that going to be mine, um, which was great. But I was also making sure that I was going to do a blog, like influencer. But I was able to get some coverage on some of the design choices, of like being bespoke on a budget of a lot of secondhand building materials or the different way of DIY that's not just like HGTV. But that was a whole thing, but it was nice to get some coverage on the work that I invested. And then there was a phase of, which is kind of current, of just writing in fellowships, of scratching the itch of, hey, I want to do this thing, right? I don't have the time to do a full grant application, but I can do um, maybe a couple month fellowship or investing in a certain topic through AIA or the Architectural Year Urban Design Forum. Um, I did some through the Civic Leadership Program or Next City through their Vanguard program, and recently written an op-ed for Oculus. And I want to get into what I'm doing at GSA. So, as the regional chief architect, I'm in charge of everything design for the New York office. I manage a team of was 18 people until recently. It's a lot smaller, but it's multidisciplinary architects, planners, engineers, historic preservationists, fine arts, public art, public architecture. As an agency, we do federal real estate for the executive branch. This isn't one of our GIS tools that shows in red a lot of our leased inventory and blue the owned inventory, but it's a very big portfolio. So I know that a lot of students, especially your generations, want to be more mission driven and have impact and not just always be working on a CD set. And for me, as a public architect, which is an alternative path in architecture, I found that way to have impact as we own the process of the inception, the planning, the development, packaging the project before we hand it off to the architects the way they can design it. Or part of my job is hiring and evaluating the architects who is best suited for this project. But it looks a lot like a lot of federal office buildings, federal courthouses. We have specialty buildings, which are laboratories or data centers, as well as land ports of entry. Um, we do have a lot of programs. I talked a little bit about how we do it through a lot of my responsibilities of setting national design excellence policies, but also enforcing them on a project level or a local level. We have a process of how you hire architects, very rigorous, most qualified firms. And then it's also about what you do during design. So we have a process that we call the peer review process, which is like having a pinup for professionals. You're like, okay, well, SOM is a known name. They're great. Well, what happens when Tom Main shows up as a peer to critique the work. And it really makes the firms come with their best foot forward and show what they're working on. There are major programs across any of the disciplines in the built environment. This is what I deal with on a daily basis, whether it's working with EDC, New York City agency. I cover specifically the Northeast and the Caribbean. So these programs change based on geography as well. This is one great project that I started as an intern. I did a master plan for the Volby Transportation Center in Cambridge. It was a 13-acre site that was way underutilized, but the government doesn't have a lot of capital for these major infrastructure projects. And the master plan was to redevelop um, some of the highest valued R&D real estate in the world, to give up 10 of the 13 acres in a public-private partnership with MIT and SOM, to redevelop 3 of those acres. For me, it was a great exercise as an entry-level intern in the excellence program, but then to see this built as a beautiful, high-performance platinum building. Part of our programs is art and architecture. There's a Maya Lin commission in the landscape, which is quite beautiful as well, but it's a holistic approach to what we're doing because we're also building buildings that are, 100-year buildings. We invest in the long term for sustainability, for resilience, but also just like good workplace. This is a land port of entry that we do with Tom Main. Fascinating project. There's like 7 different buildings on this campus, and what you see as like the bridge across the entire campus is uh, it's really a parking garage because each of those buildings had its own requirement. Realize, oh, this is why you hire like really great thinkers and Pritzker Prize winning firms because the big bold move was remove all the parking requirements for each of the buildings and just put it across the entire campus as one connected bridge. There's also an image of Ann Hamilton's commission for what we call the head house, which is if you do have to leave your vehicle for processing or for paperwork or for inspection, there's this beautiful, like 230-foot long linear textile work, which is really great. It's just nice to see these projects come to fruition. This is one that we actually worked on with TT. Andrew was on that project. This is a great land port of entry that just got its construction award. We broke ground, or we're about to break ground. Was designed with Smith Miller Hawkinson. There's a hybrid mass timber structure for the roof assembly. And it's really interesting because this one is one of 3 land ports of entry crossing with Canada that has an Amtrak component. So it wasn't just the normal, hey, bikes and RV seasonal, tourism across this Canada border, but there is an Amtrak component which GSA had never had to deal with. Kind of train station, and then navigating that, which is a really rigorous design process. This is a courthouse project I'm working on in Puerto Rico, um, which is really interesting context to work in, especially under the current political climate of what does it mean for the federal government to build a 200,000 square foot courthouse annex in Puerto Rico? One building is not going to fix the geopolitical or socioeconomic conversations, but it can be a step in the right direction. And it's more than just the building. It's like it's a seismic zone, it's a hurricane zone, a lot of materials you can't get on the island. So then you're trying to figure out how do you flat pack it, ship it to the island. Um, and then also make it beautiful, make it functional, make it dignified of the mission of the judicial branch of the U.S. courts of the District of Puerto Rico. It's a fascinating project. It's really difficult. It's really great. It's not always great to go to Puerto Rico and wear a suit for work, but it is nice to go to Puerto Rico. And the last one I'll mention was a project that we did, really a studio with NJIT with George and Theodore, where we partnered for the federal campus in Newark. What really started as there was no real goal. We just knew that we needed to work on our public spaces between the buildings. So we partnered with NJIT. George and Theodore snatched this up as a great their own backyard project. And we had a great fall 2021 studio. A lot of the students then revealed that they themselves had gone through these federal buildings for services from the government, immigration, naturalization services. And it's like a unique experience where because it was hyper local, there's a new perspective of users and designers and students. That studio, not knowing that this would happen, was what helped us to get $3 million of funding for this project and stand up a program across the country of $20 million, a bucket of $20 million to reinvest in just punk sites, essentially, or just under-maintained sites. And we got attention from the White House. The last administration, the White House chief executive for sustainability showed up for this press release. And then we were able to hire Marvel Architects to do kind of a visioning plan, master plan, and design this first phase. So, it is incremental. A lot of things we don't know how it's going to turn out, but you just work towards it. You always demand excellence and try to make it better and set up, whether it's you or someone else, set them up for success with these projects.
You, David, Betsy, Laura, Jacob. Yeah, thank you for such inspiring presentations and also for setting the ground for me to say that designers are those who question the status quo and prototype improvements. I've been learning to prototype through training and practice, doing, as people have said, a little bit of everything from urban mobility to co-founding Sustrato, also co-founding a street furniture company, working in disaster recovery, post-war humanitarian work, here in New York, public spaces, and also some other creative outlets, as Betsy mentioned. And but my need to question the status quo traces before architecture school. For example, as part of a large family from two community-oriented cultures, I learned that individuality is an illusion. I also saw my mom do so much with very little, and like most people, had many opportunities to see how unequitable is the distribution of opportunities. Until recently, I thought my career was very random, but now I see that it has been closely aligned with my convictions. For example, the conviction to dismantle these two myths of scarcity and inequality. On scarcity, a decade-old project is El Peral Pocket Park, which is located in a marginalized neighborhood in Mexico City that, because of the socioeconomic conditions, was given this poverty alleviation grant to build this so underwhelming federal government project that was going to use $40,000 to build two metal umbrellas and a green wall. Even in New York, that gets you way more. So we work with neighbors, a contractor, and neighbors, the contractor, and the staff from federal government to redesign the project within the limitations of the federal grant that we had to keep the same elements. The project was actually cheaper, and we used the remaining budget to create even more additions to the project. Because the neighbors were part of the design process and also the construction process, they were on site adding all this rain harvesting system, the herb garden, the fruit orchard that you see has papayas, and it uses the water from the rain to water, a library, the human-sized chessboard that they actually use. Of course, they know better what they're going to use. And this is one of the many events. Until today, the neighbors continue to activate and take care of the space because they were part of the construction process. They know how to take care of it and how to keep adapting it to their changing needs. And yeah, going to one of the events and seeing how people come together so easily, I asked them, where were you meeting before? And they said they didn't know each other before the park existed. They met through the construction of the park. I also work in Peru after Hurricane Maria. Peru after a series of flash floods displaced people into shelters. By the moment I arrived, people were already had their basic needs covered, but they were identifying some mental health challenges. There were a few volunteering psychologists, but patients outnumber the psychologists. And we also learned that everybody had access, or most people had access to a basic phone. So I work with two friends, those volunteering psychologists, and a few mothers. We also learned that moms didn't have the chance to leave the refugee sites while kids and men were going back to work or school. They spend most of the time there. So we work with them and develop a mental health program that use cell phone text messages to deliver this small prompts and help people to, yeah, it's called behavior activation therapy that we would deliver via SMS message. And then we used standardized surveys for mental health and focus groups to learn how successful the project was. And we learned that it actually helped reduce anxiety and feeling of loneliness. So because of that, then we did go to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And there we work with local mental health providers and the same two friends, and develop a, well, adapted libremente for elders that also had access to what they call the Obama phone. That is a phone that was given to the American government as a poverty alleviation grant. So, oh, yeah. On dismantling the myth of individuality, I was part of Mapaton. Yeah, back in the day when Mexico City did not have a map of the buses that cross the city every day and transport millions of people, the city believed there's no map. But I was like, there is a map, it's just in reality, it's in the territory. So we created an app to crowdsource that map. And in only 15 days, we collected the over 1,500 bus routes of Mexico City. And just based on the time that people spent, it would have taken one person a year and a half. And now, well, that data was open and we gave it to the government, and also like Google used it as a platform. So now if you go to Mexico City, you can use Google Maps to get to places. Here in New York, I work in Turnout NYC with the Design Trust, which, well, with Turnout, we partnered with 5 different organizations from all 5 boroughs, especially organizations located in neighbors with less concentration of cultural institutions. We, like, in only one summer, we hosted over 100 events, all free and open to the public, and showcased over 500 artists, all of whom got paid. We worked with C2 and local youth to co-design a kit of parts that would be able to move around, to showcase to host different types of performances, and also could store everything in place and become street furniture when not in use. So yeah, and we were testing with users how could this kit be placed differently in reality. Then C2 built 2 kits, one that stayed in Brooklyn and is still there, and another one that traveled first to Staten Island to a waterfront location, then to Queens to a DMAP street, Harlem under the train tracks, so it's very loud, and there were events like silent disco that you can see here, and finally the Bronx. And well, collectively with all these 5 different organizations, programming was very diverse, from Chinese, yo-yo, Filipino martial arts to Swedish marionette theater. We also did not specifically target a racial group, but turnout was more representative to the New York class census than other grants for artists, but with a greater representation of Black and Hispanic and Latino artists. I'm not going to talk about my favorite project because that takes a long time. But I want to show these photos because they show my dad in yeah, he came to test the newly built paths, and he was one of the advocates for ADA accessibility. And yeah, I want to show this because recently he helped me dismantle a third myth that I've never worked to leave a footprint, but now I know that no matter what we do, our work and our impact is going to outlive us. And that could be on the shape of a 75-hectare reforested ravine, a small, tiny message of hope, or by turning our food waste into compost. But as architects, creatives, and humans, you can design the impact that you're going to have.
Hi there. As Zoe mentioned, Jacob mentioned, I'm part of the league team. I'm Ann Rieselbach. I'm the program and membership director here. And I have a few kind of platitudes and general questions for the speakers, but my guess is that most of you have a lot of questions about this. So I'm going to quickly turn it over to all of you and to the online audience who we've noticed have been raising their hands as much as they can during the talking. So I just also wanted to, as you're already figuring out from the survey of the league's programs and publications, as well as the varied career trajectories of the four speakers, part of the underlying purpose of the league's work is fostering and sharing the myriad ways that architects can shape the landscape and built environment, catalytic, constructive, all of these things that make the environment. Similarly, the consistent thread that ties together all of these presentations is apparently that there's no single path to an architecture career from concept to realization, although I find it interesting that all four of you had discerned your career interests early enough that you were architecture majors in your undergraduate program, which isn't always the case. You didn't go in necessarily, but you came out as architecture majors. But then in your graduate degrees, you kind of diversified what you were doing through internships, which was interesting. So I have just some questions about education, since everyone here is in the middle of choosing courses and thinking about what they're going to do over the next few years. So these are sort of quick answer questions, and some of you addressed them, but I'd like to hear it anyway. What was the most valuable course that you took in undergraduate or graduate school?
Can I say two? In my undergraduate, I took like it was like essentially a development course about the global South, and it's like how our policies, in particular the U.S., and just how those structures work. I think my mind was just open beyond of like how does that play out into the built environment, into the social environment, and it was just an interesting course. It was totally not architecture, but it was just something that like I think architecture falls into a little bit of just like understanding the ramifications of those big policies. And then I loved a GIS like mapping class I took in grad school. I think I didn't know the power of spatial analysis and just seeing the power of that to analyze. I don't know, we like able to score data from different like public apps, or one particular was something with Yelp, and just seeing how, I mean, it was kind of a little bit surveillance, but it was just like interesting that all this data was available and just track that spatially. It was really interesting.
Give a two-part answer as well. When I was starting out at Yale, I took a class called the Psychology, Biology, and Politics of Food. I don't do anything directly related to it, but you eat every day. It's really interesting to take these more holistic courses. Like I know Yale has a happiness course that's has the highest enrollment of any course they've ever offered. So I think finding opportunities to get outside the architecture school is great. A lot of grad programs will let you take courses in other schools. And then for my architectural answer, I took a studio at Princeton with Axel Killian, who is not an architect, and he now teaches at MIT. And his way of teaching studio was to get us to think bottom up rather than top down. So, for example, with model making, rather than sitting there and you design your whole project, and then the week before the final review, you make this beautiful representative model, which tends to be what a lot of architecture firms do to present to clients, and everything is just, okay, you've got your rendering and your model matches it. He instead encouraged us to use techniques like model making to explore the design process, and said, like, you shouldn't have an idea in your head of how it's going to turn out, because then that process isn't learning and exploration and teaching yourself.
Yeah, I don't have a specific class, but I do recommend looking for two things that Betsy and Laura also mentioned. One is your curiosity, and even classes that were not so great but were in things that I really cared about, I took so much advantage. And also the teachers that encourage you to be yourself, and that's something I was talking with Jacob recently, and that when Laura said, like, if your manager says no, that's the time to leave. Like, you want a place and a professor and a team that encourages you to explore and be yourself. So that would be
Um, there have been like very few times in my life that I've been privileged to be Delulu and not think about the finances of education. So I actually started at a school that didn't have an architecture program. I would transfer. And even when I was at that school, I took an intro to architecture class, which was super helpful, even though I knew there's the eventual path. Didn't go to Virginia Tech because I couldn't afford Virginia Tech at the time. Even for grad school, turned down some Ivy League schools because I couldn't afford it. But what was really helpful for me to understand where I would invest my time and money in any institution was that intro to architecture class, because it was the crash course of what is a studio, what is the pedagogy, what is the time intensity, like how do I administer my time to not pull all nighters every week. So that one was really impactful, just to understand like what.
It was, but I think you've already addressed this. Going to ask you about a truly outlier course, but how about, and which will lead to what you're doing now, any additional activities outside of your coursework when you were in school that impacted your decisions later
Um, One of my best friends in the architecture program at undergrad um, kept asking me, it's like, you're always involved, you're always like one step ahead, and you're always doing these things. It's like you always seem to have it so together. I'm like, I'm doing all these things because I don't have it together, right? Like I don't know what first job I want. I don't know what type of like building typology or type of practice. Is it residential? Is it public? Whatever. So I was really doing study abroad programs, design build program. I tried to do like a summer program in real estate, did like a workshop in cost of vaulting. But it was really like the time that I had as a student to figure out like, what are all these things and test them out.
well, to me, it was I before architecture school, I was in a Catholic school, private school, and then I went to national university that it was more representative of the world. So being in a school with so much diversity was very impactful for me, and having collaboration, and yeah, really doing that thing that they will say in Catholic school, like, we're all equal, and then it's like, yeah, we are all equal, doesn't matter, like our backgrounds don't matter. um yeah, so I think that.
I really love to travel, and no one can afford to travel as much as they want to. And so finding opportunities to use extracurriculars and grants to do that was very important to me. Early on in Yale, I had the opportunity to go on tour with the orchestra that I was playing in, and so otherwise I would have never gone to Turkey or Brazil or Italy. And then later, just applying for every travel grant opportunity possible. And sometimes it's a building block, and sometimes you go someplace and it's that one opportunity, and you may not ever get a chance to go back. I would just encourage you to like apply for every grant. Just sometimes your application's perfect, sometimes you just get it in by the skin of your teeth, but it can really change your life.
I think outside of architecture, I was part of a little bit later, but it was the AA like student organization. I think what it was most we started was Freedom by Design. I think what I was more interested in is like talking with all these people that basically were creating different types of ramps to for the folks to leave their homes and to be more uh, a sense of life. And I think talking to these folks, understanding their issues, and being really real with the people that are actually use our designs, use our things that we create. I think that was really helpful as an outside experience. I think sometimes we're so far removed from like the work that we're doing, but really it's like the day-to-day people and hearing those stories is really helpful just to like ground the things that I do.
Couple short individual questions and then either to each other or all of you. But Laura, what led you to first start working in Japan, which seems to, eh, I loved looking at your slides last night and each sort of path was more circular than the next. But yours seems to double back in Japan.
Yeah, that's a question that I had for a good 6 years. And I was like, why Japan? Why not somewhere else? My dad traveled a lot for work, and so as a kid, he would bring back objects from Japan that fascinated me. And starting out outside of architecture, I was interested in post-war redevelopment in Tokyo, and particularly, I could talk about this for our particularly the technological sophistication and structural achievements leading up to the 1964 Olympics. And so a lot of my early trips to Japan were trying to identify what is it about this place that produces the work that I'm so passionate about. Um, Later in grad school, the research fellowship that I got was a little bit semantic. I was looking at how contemporary Japanese architects, often use the phrasing "architecture is," and then fill in the blank. Like architecture is a cloud. Sue Fujimoto has a fantastic small book. You can read the whole thing in like 45 minutes, where it's a lot of model photos, sketches, and then like one line sentiments about architecture. And so I wanted to go and talk to these architects about how they think about the work, and that process really helped me understand after this long multi-year arc what it was that drew me to the conceptual underpinnings of that work in particular.
This next one is for Betsy, but it's actually for the other three of you too. Can you talk more about the development of your career in city planning, shift to the public sector? And this is a question for all three of you, some of the civic leadership development programs that have informed your work and career postgraduate.
Um, I didn't mention this in my talk, but I think what really shaped some of the public service work is both my parents worked in like kind of union type jobs, and I saw my dad work for the state. I think while in school, I think it was a lot of like work for a big firm, work for a really shiny design firm or a big architect. And then I didn't get that. And I think, but what was really driving me back to like public sector work and working for the city and working for New Yorkers is the idea that like I just didn't jive well of like the one designer to fix all issues in the world or one building to do it all. I think working together as a collective, working amongst different multidisciplinaries, working with politics and the economics was just like much more interesting of a problem or a place to be in. Public service, I think, is a way to do that. I didn't realize there were people in similar to David, where working with a design background, with architecture in the public sector, whether it's that through city planning, where I am at EDC, or just multiple different avenues of doing work. It's not maybe your own work. I work a lot with consultants who do the actual production and design, but it's really like working with them to solve these bigger issues or think about housing and stuff like that. So I think I work much better working together, and I think that's what public sector offered me to like work together and work for a bigger cause. And then I think that led to like some of the civic leadership programs. I think a lot of that came from 2020, but it was just the idea that that we don't need to just do it on our own. And I think working together with people who are just really invested to be a civic leader, to be invested in like, these are really tricky issues. We all care about it. Like, how can we work together to to dive deeper into that, even if we don't solve it in our one project or one practice? It's like we do care, and like let's show up to and to be that. And so I think those programs just like I think this is how I was raised. I think I was my parents were like, it's not just about you, it's about your siblings or your family or your bigger community. And so it was like always in that mindset.
One thing that's really interesting about the federal government specifically is that we're not subject to local zoning and code. So some people don't realize that the federal government has a building code, which is actually more progressive and stringent than most municipalities. So my job is, in addition to leading the designs, is to go through all of the design reviews, and we're essentially the building department for the federal government to make sure that it's built robustly, resilient, sustainable, and secure for federal buildings. So there is this bigger thing of impact where you can think big about policies. Some people don't realize how progressive the federal government can be. Like in our building code, because it's ours, we can say the minimum is LEED gold. That's just a given, right? It's a little more difficult to have that conversation right now, but we can make decisions to say this is the definition of net zero, which until recently, net zero didn't really have a lot of clear definitions of the baseline or what the target is. So like that's the big impact. But what I like about the career in public service is you can think big but start small. Even in New York City, we're still achieving firsts. Like, hey, in this historic building, we just got a LEED gold tenant fit out workplace interior. In Puerto Rico, the project that I shared could be the first LEED platinum site silver project in Puerto Rico. There's still so much work to be done that even if you're thinking in this large scale or across a national portfolio, um, there's so much still left to be done in design and development.
Where do your design skills come into play? You're dealing with, in some cases, capital A architects. What training do you have to do all of this, and how are you then coordinating landscape, significant landscape architects and significant artists, architects?
For me in public service, like we don't do the designs. I mean, sometimes we're a little heavy-handed of like, it's not your best work, or hey, we want it a different way. Um, but it's really about it was really my education through school of like learning from the professors. How do you moderate? What is a pinup? How do you just like actually take feedback in a pinup and not be defensive, right? Listen to the jurors about how they're trying to give you constructive feedback, because that's what I do now. We are working with a lot of firms, little a, big A, whatever you want to call them, but we just want them to do good work. And part of my job is to just curate, moderate, give them the feedback like, hey, this could be better, or oh, we didn't even think about that. You're exactly right, but let me find more money or something like that.
Okay, one more question from me for Keith, all of you. Um, you've been balancing your nonprofit work with your own projects, all with a focus on public space and notably working with community leaders in the creation of space. Can you discuss some of the similarities and differences between your work here in New York City and working in Mexico City?
Yeah, actually, Sustrato did their first project in New York a few years ago. And okay, this is boring, but maybe the not necessarily the liability to be so boring, but the difference of being more afraid to take risks in New York, which I think is changing. And when I first moved to New York, it did feel like New Yorkers were very protective about you have to be like super knowledgeable of New York to be able to say something. And I felt that way, like in the imposter syndrome. It's like, oh, I just arrived. Like I and there was more resistance of New York, even with the outdoor dining program. People were like, this is not Paris. Like, well, maybe there's something to learn from Paris. So yeah, I think that resistance to change and humility of we don't have the answers. We don't have the answers to the most pressing challenges. And people who think they have, I'm suspicious. And that's why I say like designers prototype, because we're trying the answers. We're trying to find the answers. And yeah, also someone has to be brave enough to try. And that's something that the design trust started to do, more prototyping. Before it was publishing more guidebooks, and I was like, okay, like yesterday they opened a prototype for how can public spaces be more accessible to neurodivergent people. It's like, okay, we're gonna learn. We invited neurodivergent users to give their feedback, because yeah, there's no spaces we're gonna try. So it started to have that change. But the project in Staten Island had, we didn't get to coach people so much in the process. It was, yeah, I don't think they're ready to do the process again by themselves. We would need to do that more.
All of you, who's going to be the first person to ask a question?
Okay, it looks like we have on the back. I'm seeing the online questions, so I will pose those to you, but they're coming from students who are tuning in online. Uh,
So my question is for Laura. My name is Shrestha, and I'm also at Yale currently doing their post-pro program. I'm architect. So I was curious about this advantage of carbon storage in timber and mass timber projects. And I was wondering if you have a research division at Shigeru Ban and how maybe it ties up into design, because you said that you continuously study the evolution of your structures and work on new systems and details for your projects. So just curious about what the process is there.
Sorry, I missed like two keywords in what you were
Yes.
saying. You were wondering if we have what at SB?
The research division
Oh,
for mass timber because of the carbon storage advantages that it has in construction. And you also said that your details keep it, like the building structures evolve based on what you're building. So just curious if that ties up into the design practice at Shigeru Ban.
yeah, I would say a lot of that is driven by our consultant collaboration rather than we don't have an in-house research division, for example. We're about 80 people globally, and we're all architects, which is a double-edged sword because you get to have your hands in everything, but we also don't have an IT person or an HR person. Like, we are everything. And so at a very basic level, a lot of what we do from one project to the next is think about how to do better. So from a carbon perspective, at a very base level, projects dating back to maybe the 2010 to 2015 range were all being fabricated in Switzerland and then shipped elsewhere in the world. And now, just as a starting point, we think like, okay, how do you work with regional fabricators, regionally available materials, rather than shipping timber around the world, and then all of a sudden you lose a lot of the benefits that by saying like, oh, wood is good for your project. That's a one-line answer, and it may not be correct by the time you get to the building site. In terms of carbon accounting, we're always working with outside consultants from the outside of a project. So rather than designing something and then saying like, hey, can you check this for us? Did it work out okay? We're working with firms like Transolar from concept design. Again, getting the whole team together. We'll start with a sketch from Shigeru. The architects will go through and work on that design and start talking about materiality really from the first conversation. And this is something in studio projects, I always hate when a studio says like, okay, you're going to design something for 10 weeks. And now you're going to think about like 1 week before the final review, make it a timber structure, make it, whatever it may be. Really thinking about materiality and real world factors like transportation as a critical part of your design process is important to the way that we work.
Were we going to alternate, or should we go to more questions from the audience? Okay, great. So this is a question from online, and it's to all four of you. Would you recommend doing a non-licensed architectural studies major or a different humanities/STEM major before going to grad school for architectural design?
Even though it's not what I did, I would say yes. If you know you're going to go to architecture school, explore as much as possible. I'm really grateful that I had a liberal arts undergrad degree rather than a professional one because I was able to explore so many other things along the way to architecture.
I think it depends on each person. So would need more context to.
Don't have that context at the moment, but maybe they will get in touch later.
I would agree with Kemi. I think it's really up to you as a person where your passion line. I think if I were to redo my thinking, I would have done a liberal arts or 4-year program or architectural practice type thing, and then still do a master's of architecture and urban design. I think that's where my focus really relied. But I also know a lot of people who didn't do a master's, and that's also okay. I think like cost is a real issue, time, and so you should weigh those things as well. And I think just balancing those, what works for you personally, financially, realistically. I think there's many ways to get to where you want to be through different types of education, whether those fellowship programs, things that we did, like the urban design for, like those are ways to like begin to go back. But I think I loved the undergrad I did, but if I to redo it, maybe I would do something else and then go back for a master's.
I just wanted to clarify, I had to do an MArch, otherwise I couldn't have gotten licensed. And so I think if I had a professional undergrad degree, then maybe I would have used grad school to explore something else. So I guess my main advice is like don't narrowly put on blinders and do solely architecture all day, every day for a decade.
Was just want to add that like whatever program you choose, like unfortunately architecture is typically very rigid. And part of that is for accreditation. Like there are pedagogical reasons that you have to take certain classes in certain sequences. But there usually is wiggle room, right? Like if maybe there's a replacement for a certain course, or instead of making your elective another architecture class, choose something else, right? Diversify in the ways that you can. Can be a summer study abroad. And that's one way that I went to Argentina for a summer, and then was able to get different credits for my next fall semester, and then took a different class that wasn't what my peers were taking. So find the way to make it work for you, regardless of what program you choose.
Okay, let's see the hands again. We go here, then over there, and then back here.
Hi, my name is Isabel Montez. I'm a 4th-year undergrad architecture student at RPI. I just want to say thank you for sharing all of your stories about your career trajectories. It's really comforting to hear that it's not so linear. And I just had a question about licensure. Did you all know you wanted to be licensed, or did it come as a result of your path in life? And how did you come to that decision to become licensed?
Um, I knew I wanted to be licensed just because I think there's a certain kind of notoriety or weight when you're a bona fide licensed architect. Even in a non-traditional role as a public architect, I'm not the one stamping drawings, so that I am licensed in DC, New York. But it's also similar to like if you're a doctor or a lawyer, the educational path is actually quite similar. So if you're a lawyer that hasn't passed the bar, it is a little bit different, but it's not the only path. I think it continues to be a personal thing. I think there are certain changes that are happening with NAB and NCARB that are removing some of those very real barriers to licensure. But for me, because I was in a public sector job, did have long days on occasion, but my schedule was more predictable. I wasn't working 10 or 12-hour days like my peers. So I told myself, I don't have an excuse. I have time to study, and did all the AREs in 9 months, which was really like aggressive, but I had the time, right? So if I weren't in public sector, maybe if I were pulling the 12-hour days at a private sector firm, it wouldn't have been the same thing for me.
For me, licensure was, I think, similar to David, was like an insurance for the future. Let's say I do want to pivot again and go back to architecture and design. If I want to like help a friend out in their and renovations, like something, it just gave me assurance that I could go back to that. I think also it just gives you a credit, like it gives you leg up a lot of ways in different firms. So I think it is helpful. I think it's also really helpful if you can find a firm that pays for exams because they're very expensive. And then to start, especially if you're working in New York, start some of those internships early. I think cost is a real thing, but I think also you don't know where you're going to end up being. And so I haven't had to use my license actually in the work that I was doing, but maybe I will. And I think that's I know maybe later down the line it will be really hard to study for those exams, and so I think that was my thinking behind it.
Well, in Mexico, we all get licensed, so it's different. But I'm not licensed as architect in the US because I don't practice as an architect. Yeah, to me it was like, wait, what? Like you go to school and you don't get a license? It's the same in Europe. Like I went to school for 5 years and then get licensed in years, 4 years. So I would do that extra year. And I was thinking uh, credentials, although yeah, do help. And as Laura was saying, like good grades, that gives you fellowships. And now maybe our grades are not relevant, but at that time when you're applying for a international exchange, they're useful. So yeah, if those things are available, why not?
I think it's really important to think about, do you want to get licensed the same way that you think about, do you want to go to grad school? And each step along my career, I tried to test things out before committing to them. So working in a firm before deciding to go to grad school, starting to work again after grad school before deciding to really rigorously pursue licensure. And so at the same time, that meant logging hours, even though I wasn't sure yet when I was going to start taking the exams. I thought I was ambitious trying to do all my exams in a year, but clearly David bested me here. It's a really big time commitment. And being at SBA and trying to fit in studying, it was like before work, on the train, lunch breaks, just trying to crank it out as quickly as possible and not have it, take over all of my free time. I'd also add that logging hours can be quite difficult when you're not getting experience in specific areas that you need in order to get licensed. And I was working on a lot of early design phase work at the beginning of my career, and I needed construction administration hours. And I couldn't get that on the timeline that I wanted to get licensed. And so I started doing Habitat for Humanity outside of the office, just adding up various ways to round out that experience so that I could maintain my timeline rather than being a little bit more passive about what my job offered me towards licensure.
Hi, my name is Nathan. I'm an MArch student at Pratt. And one thing I really valued about all four of your presentations was the importance of studying and working abroad. For me personally, studying abroad and having opportunities to do workshops internationally has been very important to me and important to my aspirations of becoming an architect. I think my question sort of overlaps a little bit with the previous question. Being an MArch student, like my main motivation is to like get licensed, but I'm also interested in exploring a career at like the global scale as well. And I know there's some like rigidity to being licensed in the US as well as alongside like international work. So I was curious if you had any advice in sort of navigating a career internationally as well as within the US.
Like everybody's saying, I haven't actually had to use my license. I'm not stamping on behalf of my firm. The principals are doing that. So it was important to me in my own development to get licensed. But it wouldn't have stopped me along the way. The internships that I had in Japan, very early career phase, did not matter, if you're logging hours, etc. I would say it, you do need to look into the specifics of like, do you have a US licensed architect who can sign off on your hours and does that become a problem? I think for me, the flexibility in my timeline to say like I can get licensed 3 months later, 1 year later, because I was prioritizing an international experience, like I wouldn't trade that at this point.
Okay.
I'm going to add to that really quick about the kind of international or global practice. I think it all also depends like what type of thing you're trying to do. Um, a lot of jurisdictions have reciprocity. So if you're licensed in the US, there is some path to reciprocity from Canada, the US, and Mexico. It was the same for when I was licensed in DC. If I wanted to pay the extra fees, I could be DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Like that, there are ways to use that license, and I think the UK, the REBA has something with the US as well. But it's not just about the actual license. There are practices like if you're working for the State Department, overseas building operations for embassies and consulates, you could be in a US based firm designing embassies across the world, right? Or it could be just private homes. There are different rules, building codes, or licensure requirements around residential. So I think there's kind of any way to do that depending on kind of where you start to fall.
Yeah, and I would say when hiring someone and working with someone, well, maybe because of the type of work I do, the license is not the main thing, but portfolio, your interest, how aligned you are with the mission, the drive, those are things that are more important to me. Yeah, that you already have.
Yeah, so going back to the previous question, wanted to emphasize there are positives to the licensure process. I know a lot of people talk about how grueling it is, expensive, et cetera. I learned so much studying for my licensing exams, content that was never addressed in school. And even though we're all sitting here saying like, well, we didn't need our licenses, it is extremely helpful. It represents a certain level of accomplishment and experience that you do carry into everything, even if you're not literally stamping all the time.
Yeah, and I would just add, in my role, similar to, we're reviewing other architects and designers' drawings and their plans, and so having that mindset and that knowledge expertise, like, we're not just simply a client that just says, "Yes, that's a cool design," but we're like, "Oh, well, how does this practically work?" Using my knowledge as I think you're right, like, I learned a lot in that because I did it, like, right after undergraduate school and, like, study for these things. I was learning a lot about, like, building systems and, the details of how a window wall comes together, and so just, like, those things are really practical and, like, applied now to the work that I do, as well.
Hi, I'm Kat from Cooper Union, and I'm a fourth year. Thank you for sharing your experiences. It's very inspiring to hear. And I have a question specifically for David and Laura. I wanted to ask, how do you balance teaching and working, and specifically, how do you work around the university schedule?
Um, like I mentioned, with like a government job, my schedule was more predictable, and did have to travel or to pull some long days for deadlines, but it's predictable. Like if I said, "Hey, I'm teaching this course once a week," I had some liberty to just make that happen. Um, I also hopped around schools. Not every school is the same. It's not always about your employer. There was one time where I had started to say no to this school that I taught it for 6 years because I realized they were putting me in a course that I had to teach twice a week for the same pay of another course that only met once a week. So technically, I had twice as many contact hours with the students, and it started to like become an issue. So I switched schools to a better program. So you still have to figure out what works for you, regardless of university schedule or your employer. But you just have to ask, right? Sometimes they're like, "Hey, well, you're on this project, and just because of staffing, it's not going to work out. But maybe next school year." And if they're listening to you, they will try to make it happen. And if they're not, like someone else said, that's the sign you find a new employer, whether it be your actual day job or the university.
I have to base it around what my other work entails, and so there have been times when it has been, crazy deadline season, working very late where I couldn't fit something else in. I was fortunate that for this fall, I have a project that's nearing the end of construction documents phase. I can take some time away from the office. Last year teaching, I did not reduce my office hours nearly enough to accommodate the time that I wanted to put into teaching. And so I was just very, very busy. And so learned from that, cut back a little bit more at the office. And it's definitely helping my life holistically at this point. But yeah, teaching studio, it's really hard to get out of the office. And for a lot of other faculty members who are like in the building all day, I'm, catching the train and running in the door. And a lot of other people are just like, we're talking, we're going to meetings. I would love to try teaching full time at some point. Maybe that's some version of a sabbatical. But I've always enjoyed juggling these multiple ways of engaging with the same subject matter. So I think just learning to have some balance and not take on too much, which I'm still learning how to do.
Okay, there are a lot of questions. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more. I know we had you over here, and then we're gonna do another hand raising moment, and we'll pick our final 2. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Varun. I'm from Cornell. I'm a third year grad student. My question to you guys is, if you can go back, what's the one thing that you would have done differently in your architecture trajectory?
I would have studied Japanese. I was told to, yeah, I mean, I can apologize profusely and order coffee, but not much more than that. I started my undergrad doing what I was told I should do. And so I was told like, oh, you should speak Spanish. And so I took courses that I thought were good to set me up for some mystery career in the future, and not knowing what that was. I wish I had been a little bit more aligned to what I knew my core interests were. Again, like everyone's parents wants to make sure you like get a job and can pay off your student loans, et cetera. And so I was on a track to be responsible for my future and not necessarily like there's a lot of risk in just kind of winging it and hoping it comes together in a nice diagram that yields a career that you can talk to a great room full of people about. But yeah, I think maybe just being a little calmer in that process and leaning into my own interests.
Mine is silly, but maybe just not staying up so late because now I wear glasses because of architecture school. Uh, but yeah, before architecture school, I was like 2020, and after that, I had to use glasses. So, and I think also that's important because should not that sometimes continues in the work environment and the culture, and it is not necessary. If you plan it better, like this super impressive buildings, and you can still predict your week. So yeah, just it is possible. And then I did an internship in Spain, and I was working with a German student, and I was like, oh, we can do these things in time, and so yeah, that would be my silly answer.
I think similar to what everyone was saying is like not, I was just, especially in undergrad, just taking all the courses that were super prescribed. I did branch off a little bit, but I wish I just dive deeper into actual interest and not been so scared about whether this will all lead to a nice package job at the end. I mean, it's all 20 hindsight because it worked out in the end. But I think like I wish I took a law class. I wish I took like in the right way, like an environmental studies class. I wish it just like all these like classes and the professors are just interesting. I just never did it because studio is really overwhelming. We were pulling all nighters. And so I think just making space for that, knowing that you could still graduate with a degree, have a wonderful portfolio, but also have room to explore those other things.
I would just say like enjoy the moment, whatever it is. Right? If you're in a certain course, just use that time for that semester to learn what you can about that course. Um, the other part of your education, I know a lot of you are or locally based or New York City based students, like the city is part of your education. So like get out of the building, like go walk by a building, go walk by the construction site, but like take advantage of what's here in New York.
the Architectural League program. We have time for one more question, and then Damasi.
Okay, seeing all the hands, this is hard. Something that we can offer all of you is if you want to email me, but you all have my email with a specific question that you want to pose to the panelists, we can filter that through to them and they can have the option to respond over email after this live event. So I think we're going to go over here, and then if this is a short answer, in the back over there. So sorry. We got to get you guys to your studio tours.
Morning. Thank you for being here. James Doyle, current architecture student with City Tech. My question is to all of you. It revolves around AI. As we see AI continue to evolve, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how it's reshaping the role of the architect, not just in terms of workflow itself, but in reshaping creativity and responsibility within the design process. Thank you.
It's a tricky one. I think one of the words that you mentioned is workflow. I think AI has a tremendous opportunity to change how we work, but I don't really think it's going to replace the architect, right? There's a certain expertise or need that we have as professionals that's not necessarily going to go away, and not just because of our skill set. It's other structures around building codes and who's liable and the whole licensure and financial thing as well. So I don't really see architects going away. You shouldn't worry about like, oh no, they're not going to hire interns. Okay, the stability of the financial market is probably more of a driver than just AI for like architecture jobs.
I think it's important for any project, for all of our diverse perspectives on professional roles in architecture, for the diversity of perspectives that you get even on a single project team. Each person brings a unique experience to a project, and so I think AI will help drive efficiency in the workflow, but you can't replace. Like, I could not execute the same work as any of the other panelists because I don't have their backgrounds. I don't have that specific hands-on experience, and there's only so much that a non-human entity can glean and apply to a project. It's really helpful. Like, how do you gauge what the community thinks without having that in-person conversation? I think it's similar to, like, yes, my office works on projects all around the world, but we're always partnering with local people. We're not, sitting in a vacuum thinking that we know and understand everything. And so I think human engagement, like, maybe it's a good opportunity that architects can really emphasize the human side of architecture, and maybe some of the efficiency gets picked up and maybe we can sleep more.
I think what we can't plan for, especially in work that is more public facing, that intersects with the politics, is like the unknown. I think I work on a lot of planning projects. We go through city processes called ULURP or general project plan, and those have community buy-in, and those community buy-in can be a yes or no to a project. And I think AI can make things more efficient. The workflow might be seamless, but a project or a public space, a public realm will change based on that feedback. And that is something you can't predict because the community will change, the politics will change, the power structure. I think like we use AI more for like workflow and like making things like flow better, summarize, but I'll use that for that. But I think using our sensitivities and knowing like the human to human connection, understanding communities, talking to people, like that is something we can't replace, and that impacts the work that we do.
Yeah, and I think AI, like many tools, can be used really, really well. And I've done projects I didn't show, but like with Instagram and with Facebook, because as I say, like a hammer can be used to destroy, but also to build. So it all depends on how you use it. And as designers and collaboration, is like we've been talking about collaboration, and I see like how do we collaborate with AI, and I see a lot of other friends who are designers, how they collaborate. It's not like do my homework and think for me, because it actually can't. But there's some efficiencies that it can create as a tool, but also like even the ideas that it sparks, or
creating something super fast without you spending so much time. It helps you go to different places, and then the randomness of your brain of like, oh, because you said blue, I thought about a bird flying, and then use that, right? So that collaboration, not as a substitute.